Hi, and welcome back to Watermelon Football. Today we're going to be recapping the NFL Week 14. The week started with an extremely close and entertaining Thursday night football game between the Steelers and the Vikings. The Vikings dominated the first half of the game and were winning 29-0 halfway through the third quarter, with Dalvin Cook having 2 touchdowns in his first game back from injury. However, in the second half, Pittsburgh almost came back. They had 3 touchdowns in the fourth quarter alone and could have sent the game to overtime had Pat Freiermuth caught a perfect pass from Ben Roethlisberger on the last play of the game. Kirk Cousins ended the game with 216 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions, while Roethlisberger ended with 308 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Najee Harris had 94 yards on the ground and 1 rushing touchdown, and added another rushing touchdown through the air, while Dalvin Cook had an incredible 205 rushing yards with 2 touchdowns. For the pass catchers, Chase Claypool led the way for Pittsburgh with 93 yards, while Deontay Johnson, James Washington, and Pat Freiermuth followed with 76, 65, and 32 yards respectively. Washington and Freiermuth also added a touchdown each. For Minnesota, KJ Osborne had 83 yards and a touchdown, while Justin Jefferson had 79 yards and a score. However, after the game, critics were criticizing Chase Claypool for a celebration with 10 seconds left. His first down celebration took a few seconds off the clock, which could have gave Pittsburgh 1 more play to tie the game. On defense, Pittsburgh did not get any sacks or interceptions. However, the Vikings got a multitude of sacks, with 5 different players each recording 1 sack. Bashaud Breeland also added with an interception. The Vikings ended up winning by a score of 36-28. Next up, we have the Baltimore Ravens versus the Cleveland Browns in what turned out to be another very close game. Cleveland was winning by far until the very end, when Baltimore almost came back, but fell just short. Baker Mayfield had 190 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception. And while Lamar got hurt early, Tyler Huntley came in and performed admirably in his absence. 270 yards, 1 touchdown, and 0 interceptions. For the Browns, Nick Chubb had 59 yards rushing, while for the Ravens, Devontae Freeman rushed for 64 yards. In the pass game, Mark Andrews led the way for Baltimore with 115 yards and 1 touchdown, followed by Rashad Bateman with 103 yards. For the Browns, there was no standout leader, but Jarvis Landry ended up with the most yards with 41 yards and 1 touchdown, and Austin Hooper ended up with 30 yards and 1 touchdown. Latavius Murray also caught 1 touchdown, which was only 1 yard. On the defensive side of the ball, the Ravens didn't have any sacks and only 1 interception by Anthony Averett. But for the Browns, there were sacks from Takros McKinley with 1, Myles Garrett with 1, Jadeveon Clowney with 1.5, and John Johnson III with half of a sack. The final score ended up being 24-22 Browns, but the Ravens covered the +3 spread. Coming up ahead, we have the Jacksonville Jaguars versus the Tennessee Titans, and I bet you guys can guess how this one ended. Trevor Lawrence had 221 yards, 0 touchdowns, and 4 interceptions. And while Tannehill did much better than Lawrence, he still didn't put up very good numbers. Less than 200 yards, 0 passing touchdowns, and 0 interceptions, although he did add 1 rushing touchdown. The Jaguars' rushing attack was absolutely horrible this game. James Robinson was their leading rusher with 4 yards and 0 touchdowns. Meanwhile, the Titans at least mustered a mediocre performance from Deontay Foreman with 47 yards and 1 score. Thankfully for the Jaguars, their receivers performed much better than their run game did, with Marvin Jones having 70 yards, Laquan Treadwell with 68, and Laviska Shenault with 34. The leading receiver on the Titans was Jeff Swain with 45 yards. For the defense, the Jaguars actually managed a pretty good game. with 4 sacks coming from Damian Wilson, Jihad Ward, Roy Robertson Harris, and Dwayne Smoot. Tennessee, on the other hand, only managed 3 sacks from Danico Autry, Harold Landry, and Derek Roberson, but managed 4 picks against Lawrence, with Buster Skrine, Jaylen Brown, Rashaan Evans, and Christian Fulton each getting an interception. The final score ended up being Jaguars 0, Titans 20. The next game is between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Las Vegas Raiders. The Chiefs blew out this game as well, leading from the very first play of the game when they returned a Josh Jacobs fumble to the end zone for a touchdown. And from there, they never looked back, dominating the entire way through. At the end of the game, Derek Carr had 263 yards with 1 touchdown and 1 interception, and Patrick Mahomes had 258 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 0 picks. Josh Jacobs, after that fumble, had a terrible day, with only 24 yards and that fumble. Meanwhile, the Chiefs' run game was much more productive, with Clyde Edwards-Helaire having 37 yards and 2 touchdowns, and Derek Gore having 66 yards and a score. However, Hunter Renfrow had a very productive game in the pass-catching department, with 117 yards and a touchdown. Meanwhile, the Chiefs' pass catchers were spread much more evenly, with Tyreek Hill having 76 yards, Nicole Hardman having 59 yards, and Darrell Williams having 31 yards and a touchdown. For the defense, the Raiders had 4 sacks on Patrick Mahomes, with Yannick Ngakoue, Clelin Ferrell, Malcolm Kuntz, and Deshaun Warden all having 1 sack. Meanwhile, for the Chiefs, Melvin Ingram, Frank Clark, and Chris Jones all had half a sack, while Alex Okafor had 1.5 sacks. Tyrann Mathieu also added an interception. The final score of this game was Chiefs 48, Raiders 9. Next up comes another blowout game, pitting a mediocre team against a terrible one. We have the Seattle Seahawks against the Houston Texans. Russell Wilson had 260 yards with 2 touchdowns and 0 interceptions. Meanwhile, his counterpart Davis Mills actually had a very good game with 331 yards, although he only had 1 touchdown. He didn't throw any picks. On the ground, Rashad Penny had an amazing game. He had 137 yards and 2 scores. But on the other hand, with the Texans, Rex Burkhead led their ground assault and only had 40 yards and didn't reach the end zone. Any fantasy owners that had Tyler Lockett on their team must have been extremely happy with his performance. He had 142 yards and a touchdown. But managers who had DK Metcalf must have been very disappointed because he only had 43 yards and didn't reach the end zone. The other pass-catching touchdown went to Gerald Everett, who also had 15 yards. For the Texans, Brandon Cooks led the way with 101 yards, followed by Nico Collins at 69 and Brevin Jordan at 26 with a touchdown. For defense, Al Woods and Rasheem Green both had half of a sack for the Seahawks, and Darrell Taylor had 1 sack. However, the Texans didn't record any interceptions or sacks, just capping off a terrible day for Houston. The final score was Seahawks 33, Texans 13. The Steelers' defensive line is led by one of the best D linemen in all of football. TJ Watt has 16 sacks on the year, which is the most in the NFL. Other notable D linemen include Cameron Hayward with 6.5 sacks and Chris Wormley with 5 sacks. However, their secondary has massively underperformed, with only 6 interceptions on the year, which is the 24th best in the NFL. If the Steelers want to make the playoffs, it is very important that their secondary gets some more interceptions to stop the other teams from scoring. The last 1 o'clock game is the Dallas Cowboys versus the Washington football team. This game was a lot like the Browns versus Ravens game from earlier. Dallas went up by a lot of points, but Washington almost came back in the fourth quarter. They scored 12 points in the fourth quarter alone. Ultimately, though, it wasn't enough. They came just 1 touchdown short. Dak did not have a very good game. He had 211 yards, which is okay, but had 1 touchdown and 2 interceptions. Meanwhile, Taylor Heinicke had only 122 yards and only 1 touchdown, and he threw 1 interception. The run game for both teams was a little bit weak, as Ezekiel Elliott only ran for 45 yards, and Antonio Gibson only ran for 36. In the passing game, CeeDee Lamb led the Cowboys with 61 yards, followed by Michael Gallup at 60 and Amari Cooper at 51. However, Cooper also scored a touchdown. For the football team, Cam Sims led the football team in receiving yards with 69, plus he scored one touchdown. Second place was Adam Humphrey with 34. On the other side of the ball, we had a great defensive showing by both teams. DeMarcus Lawrence, Randy Gregory, and Neville Gallimore all had one sack for the Cowboys, and Micah Parsons continued his defensive rookie of the year for sure, and possibly even defensive player of the year campaign with 2 more sacks. That brings him up to 12 sacks on the year. Randy Gregory also added an interception. For Washington, Daron Payne and Jonathan Allen each had 1 sack, and Landon Collins had 2. Landon Collins also had an interception and is joined by Cole Holcomb, who also got an interception. Although it was a close game, Dallas ultimately covered the spread, winning 27-20. Now we're up to the 425 games. The first 425 game that we're going to be discussing is Detroit versus Denver. And this was not a close game at all, and nobody expected it to be. Denver came in with a 500 record, and Detroit came in with only 1 win. Jared Goff threw for 215 yards with 1 touchdown and 1 interception. Meanwhile, Teddy Bridgewater performed worse with 179 yards, 2 touchdowns, but 0 picks. The Lions' top 2 running backs were injured, so Craig Reynolds got most of the carries, and he delivered with 83 yards. For the Broncos, the dominant run game of Melvin Gordon and Javonte Williams continued. Gordon had 111 yards and 2 scores, and Williams had 73 yards and 1 rushing score, but 2 receiving touchdowns as well. In the receiving game, Amon-Ra St. Brown had 73 yards, Josh Reynolds had 52 yards, and Khalif Raymond only had 31 yards but added a touchdown. For the Broncos, Noah Fant had 51 yards, Jerry Jeudy had 47 yards, and Alex Okwojibunam had 41 yards and a touchdown. On defense, Alim McNeil had 1 sack for the Lions, and Draymond Jones had 2 sacks for the Broncos, and Justin Simmons had an interception, and Kenny Young had a forced fumble. Final score of this game, Denver 38, Detroit 10. Next up is the New York Giants versus the LA Chargers, and this game was much closer than anticipated. Giants came in at 4-8, and the Chargers came in at 7-5. However, Mike Glennon threw for 191 yards and more touchdowns and interceptions, with 2 touchdowns and only 1 pick. Also, he added a rush touchdown. Justin Herbert had another stellar game with 275 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions. On the ground, Saquon Barkley had 64 yards and 2 receiving touchdowns, while Austin Eckler had 67 yards and 1 rushing score. In the air, Kyle Rudolph led the Giants with 66 receiving yards, and Eli Penny, although only having 3 receiving yards, scored a huge touchdown, making the game much closer. In the absence of Keenan Allen, 2 small-name receivers stepped up in a big way. Jalen Guyton had 87 yards and a touchdown, and Joshua Palmer had 66 yards and a touchdown. Mike Williams also pitched in with 61 yards, and although Jared Cook only got 8 yards, he also punched into the end zone. On defense, Dexter Lawrence and Azeez Ojulari each had 1 sack for the Giants, and for the Chargers, Joey Bosa and Justin Jones also had sacks. Additionally, Nick Neerman also added an interception. The final score of the game was Chargers 37, Giants 21. The next 2 games were crazy. Both of them went into overtime, and this one was probably even more crazy than the next one. The 49ers versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Going into the 4th quarter, this game looked over. The 49ers were up 20-6. However, Cincinnati rallied with 14 points in the 4th quarter to start overtime. In overtime, they actually got on the board first with a field goal, but that gave San Francisco 1 turn to either tie or win the game. And San Francisco did just that. Jimmy G marched up the field and threw a game-winning dime to Brandon Ayuk for a walk-off touchdown. In the game statistics, Jimmy Garoppolo threw for 296 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions. Meanwhile, Joe Burrow threw for almost 350 yards, with also 2 touchdowns and 0 picks. Jeff Wilson Jr. rushed for 56 yards, while Joe Mixon rushed for 58. Deebo Samuel has been working into the backfield more and more every single game, and this time he actually got more yards on the ground than he did in the air. In the air, Deebo only got 22 receiving yards, but on the ground he got 37 yards and a touchdown. The game-winning pass catcher Brandon Ayuk had 62 yards and a score, and George Kittle had a monster performance, 150 yards and a touchdown. For the Bengals, T. Higgins led the way with 114 yards, and Jamar Chase, although only having 77 yards, also had 2 touchdowns. CJ Uzomah also had a very decent game with 56 yards. On the other side of the ball, Samson Ebukam and Arden Key each had half of a sack for the 49ers. Quan Williams and Azeez Al-Shaair each had 1 sack, and Nick Bosa had 2 sacks in a great game. Meanwhile, for the Bengals, 4 different players had 1 sack. B.J. Hill, Trey Hendrickson, DJ Reader, and Larry Ogunjabi. The final score of this crazy game was 49ers 26, Cincinnati 23. The second of the 2 overtime games was between 2 insane teams that are both going to go very far in the playoffs. It's the Buffalo Bills versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. This game also looked very over going into the second half, with the Bucs up 24-3. The Bills did not look good and were getting demolished. The score was also 24-10 going into the fourth quarter. The Bills had made up a little bit of ground, but it didn't look like they were going to come close to winning. But then they came back, and the game went into overtime, tied 27-27. The Bucs won the coin toss. Tom Brady marched down the field and hit Rashad Perriman with a game-winning walk-off touchdown. Josh Allen had a very good game. He threw for 308 yards, 2 touchdowns, and only 1 interception. But he didn't come close to Brady's game with 363 yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 0 picks, and even added a rare rushing touchdown for him. But Allen's night didn't stop there. He also ran for over 100 yards on the ground and a rushing score. Also, Devin Singletary added 52 yards to the Bills' run game. Leonard Fournette had another stellar performance, 113 rushing yards and a touchdown. In the receiving game, Stephon Diggs led the Bills with 74 yards, followed by Cole Beasley at 64 yards, Dawson Knox at 60 yards, and Gabriel Davis at 43 yards. Knox and Davis also added 1 touchdown each. For the Bucs, Chris Godwin led the way with 105 yards, followed by Mike Evans with 91 and a touchdown, Rob Gronkowski with 62, and the game-winning scorer Rashad Perriman with 59 yards and a score. On the defense, Matt Milano and Eli Anko each had 1 sack for the Bills, and for the Bucs, Shaq Barrett and Devin White each had 1.5 sacks, and Richard Sherman picked Josh Allen off. The final score of this crazy game was Tampa Bay 33, Buffalo 27. Next is time for Sunday Night Football, but this one was not an evenly matched game. It was the Chicago Bears coming in with only 4 wins versus the Green Bay Packers coming in with 9. But at halftime, there was a surprise for everybody. The Bears were leading 27-21. But after a Packers 17 versus 0 third quarter, they were back in the driver's seat and ended up winning. Justin Fields had a very great game with 224 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and although he had 2 interceptions, he also added 74 rushing yards. The rushing game was led by David Montgomery with 42 yards. For the Packers, Aaron Rodgers had 341 pass yards, 4 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions. Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon covered the rushing. A.J. Dillon had 71 rush yards. Aaron Jones had 35 and a touchdown, and added 30 pass yards and a touchdown. For the Packers receivers, Davante Adams had 121 yards and 2 scores. Next came Allen Lazard with 75 yards and a score. And next comes Mercedes Lewis with 51 yards. For the Bears, the leading receiver was Damiere Byrd with 76 yards and a touchdown. And next comes Jakeem Grant with 46 yards, 1 passing touchdown, and 1 punt return touchdown. The Packers safeties and cornerbacks did a great job locking up Darnell Mooney and Allen Robinson, and neither of them had a single catch. On defense for the Bears, Trevis Gibson had a sack, and Robert Quinn had 2 sacks. And for the Packers, Preston Smith had 2 sacks and a forced fumble, and Rasul Douglas had a pick 6, and Chandon Sully pitched in with another interception. The final score was Green Bay 45, Chicago 30. And of course, it's fitting that the Monday Night Football game was the most anticipated game of the week and turned out to be the best game of the week and the best upset of the week. It was the Arizona Cardinals versus the LA Rams. And while most analysts expected Arizona to pull out the win, they couldn't have been further from the truth. The Rams were leading almost the whole game. The only time they were losing was at the beginning when they were down by a field goal. Matthew Stafford threw for 287 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions, while Kyler Murray threw for 383 yards, but 0 touchdowns and 2 picks. Kyler also added 61 rushing yards. For the running back of the Rams, it was Sony Michel with Darrell Henderson out for another game, and he performed pretty well with 79 yards. For Arizona, on the other hand, the running back was James Conner, who ran for only 31 yards, but 2 rushing touchdowns, and he got 94 receiving yards. The Rams receivers all had great games. Cooper Kupp had another spectacular game with 123 yards and a touchdown. Odell Beckham Jr. had 77 yards and a score, and Van Jefferson had 58 yards and a touchdown. With that 123-yard performance, Cooper Kupp tied the record for most consecutive games with 90 or more yards. For the Cardinals, A.J. Green had a great game and led them in receiving with 102 yards. Next up came Christian Kirk with 86 and DeAndre Hopkins with 54. On defense, the Rams had Greg Gaines have 1 sack, and Aaron Donald had an amazing performance with 3 sacks. Leonard Floyd and Ernest Jones both added an interception. For the Cardinals, 3 players had 1 sack each: Chandler Jones, Zach Allen, and Jordan Phillips. The final score of this crazy upset was Rams 30, Cardinals 23.